you should get a message.
So just tell me when you want
Yeah.
me to start.
Did you get a message that recorded has started?
Oh, did I? Yeah. People in the same room looking online are saying there's a message.
Good. Interestingly, I didn't get a message. Right.
Yeah, and I think the little dot in the cloud is I think that's what's saying that it's recorded.
Right, that's telling us. Okay, let's start. So welcome everybody. I'm Helen Petrie. I'm the editor-in-chief of Interacting with Computers, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome Eva Hornecker, who is on our editorial board for the journal. And she's going to talk to us today on this very interesting topic about rethinking care robots. So without further ado, over to you, Eva, and thank you very much for offering this talk.
Hello, everyone. This is a talk about our project that had the short name ReThiCare, long for Rethinking Care Robots. And that was funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung. And they're, at least in Germany, one of the few funders where you can really do kind of open-ended research and don't have to come in with an absolutely clear idea of what exactly you will deliver. So when we saw the call that they wanted people to do something critical around roughly AI, we thought this is really the one chance to do something more innovative on care robotics, where it's really about rethinking the field. And it's an interdisciplinary project together with partners at the Technical University of Chemnitz and the University of Southern Denmark. And the project ran from 2019 to 2023. And it used a UCD creative design and development approach with design-led rapid prototyping methods to demonstrate new possibilities for care technologies. I'll talk about that. Right, I want my next slides. Yeah, so here you see some of the examples of the kinds of robots you'll probably all be familiar with that are typically envisioned for care scenarios. And there's so many projects and millions of euro of development that have gone into that, with only a couple having been tested in actual care scenarios. But the origin of these is in a very specific imagination of robots as anthropomorphic machines. And that's highly influenced by popular culture, especially science fiction. And my project colleague, Andreas Bischoff, in his work labels this a hidden curriculum that influences even the design decisions of the roboticists themselves. But if we look, there's actually very few success stories of care robots in actual use. And research doesn't prove the significance of this scenario for elderly or the care. So it's almost infuriating how this keeps persisting, and it's quite happily transmitted by the popular press with very few critical commentaries. So what keeps happening is that the remit is already the robot, and then there's a frantic search for scenarios of use where the trajectory is already set with only limited options to tweak that. Like improve the face, the movement, and refine the scenario. Okay, we've got Pepper, so now it's teaching songs. And this tech-led approach is often criticized, and even from the roboticists' research themselves. There's a trend towards more interdisciplinarity in research teams, in projects, but you rarely have the freedom to start afresh. So a lot of this research tends to downplay technical challenges, which is also something we learned from our roboticist partners from SDU. So robots are not flexible enough to react to all situations. In care, they would have to work on humans. And then there's all the ethics and care specialists that all agree that the tenet of human attention can't be given up. So care can't be given just by robots. And also the simulation of attention by robotic agents is ethically questionable. So most projects in care robotics markets start from an already clearly formulated goal, vision, and trajectory of rather complex multifunctional robots. following this specific imagination of robots as anthropomorphic machines. And we even have this lack of evidence for utility of outcomes. So how can we change that trajectory? And that was one of the key aims of our project, to demonstrate there's a much larger design space for robotic technology in elderly care. But the remit of our project was also that it's also about the methods of design, not just the outcomes, but how do we actually go about that. So we envisioned care robots as potentially simple assistive robots, as assistive robotic helper machines and devices, because if you look at the literature, the definition by Rieck, for instance, is just that they are physically embodied machines capable of enacting physical change in the world. So there's nothing much about super intelligence and whatever. So it could really be something very simple. So our goal was to explore this design space and to illustrate the opportunities. And in my talk, I'll show the spectrum from functional tools and unobtrusive helpers embedded in objects to more speculative and playful concepts that explore alternative roles for robots, for instance, to lighten up the monotony of life in care. But this design space exploration also needs creative and open-ended methods, and it starts with understanding the context. So we really needed this interdisciplinary approach where we had HCI, and sure, the roboticists, but also STS sociologists and designers. So we need design to be creative and think out of the box, but also to consider all the underlying ethics regarding universal design and human dignity, to support caregivers and enhance the quality of life. But there's also some practical constraints in terms of what in this project we could actually build. It's actually Volkswagen Stiftung quite a smallish project with a small budget for technical development compared to what you might get with the EU or something like that. So we were looking for what can we actually build, what fits the project, what's actually interesting for us to research, and what would be useful for care. We had all these disciplinary perspectives, this HCI, product design, robotics, and integrated STS in all phases of the project. So that's why this is here like surrounding, but directly active with, for instance, some of the sociologists acting as idea owners who actually push development and evaluation of an idea, and not just this kind of post hoc, oh, we'll do a workshop with you and discuss some of your ideas, and that's the entire development involvement of sociologists, humanists in a project. That's the timeline of the 4-year project. Originally, it was 3 years, but then we had money left over because of Corona and could extend almost by a full year. Above the line, you see the more focus on the actual care context, and below the line in green, the more traditional project phases of brainstorming, idea development, technical prototype development, as well as lab studies. But as you see on the top, there's all this going into the field with contextual inquiry, field ethnography, focus groups, and evaluations in the context. So we started with an initial strong field work where we were absolutely lucky to start a full year before Corona, where we could actually do this field ethnography, and then still do the brainstorming of ideas and start with basic technology development quite early. And then at some time, Corona hit. So the sessions with expert on the field and focus groups were all done online. And then at some point, the prototypes were ready to be tested, and we had 3 that were built and tested. And I'll talk about 2 of these more. And there we were also lucky that we had a 2-country project, because Corona restrictions in Denmark were very different and they opened up much earlier. So we could actually quite early do our first study. So we started with this deep immersion, where we thought we really need to understand the context with an ethnographic approach. So one of my team members did a 9-week internship, really working in the care home as an intern, very quickly, pretty much being allowed, or rather not allowed, but doing everything because, well, there's a shortage of staff labor and too much to do. So they were extremely happy to have somebody coming in. And there were more researchers that shadowed shifts. So I also shadowed 2 shifts, following staff members through their day, helping with little things. We also had a contextual inquiry phase in a Danish care home that was carefully documented in diaries and sketchbooks. And all of that also allowed us some comparison between German and Denmark, because in Denmark there's much more technology used, and this a very interesting focus on playful and gentle approaches working with people with dementia that later inspired some of our work. So here you see the photos from the care home as well as sketches done. Naturally, we weren't allowed to take photos of people. So here you see some more of these sketches. 5 researchers overall spent time at the care home, 4 in Germany, 1 in Denmark. And yeah, the German researchers all kept a daily diary per shift, and the Danish researcher did this sort of sketching diary. And you already see one of these things. Perhaps you recognize me in this picture. At some point, we had seen these lifting machines in action and thought, well, this is actually what comes closest to a robot in what we are observing now. So it would be really interesting to look at in more detail what it's like to be handled by that, but also, as you'll see here, this one is for people who can still be a little bit active, but this one is for people who are immobile. So what is it like to be lifted around, to be transported like a package out of the bed into a chair? And the lifting task also is often mentioned in the literature as something that we need robots for. So we did a sort of self-experience sessions with these 3 lifting machines, but in the analysis focused on this one as an existing tech that's also like a machine handling the person. To understand how complex care technologies are integrated into everyday care practices. And we observed 3 main things from the analysis of the video, where we ourselves were being told, okay, now you have to be really still, don't help me, shift your weight a little bit, but remember that, imagine you had a stroke and you can't really move. So there's 3 central practices that are used by practitioners of care, and I'll go into these. First, the verbal enactment of lifting procedures. This is habitual and interjected into normal conversations, descriptions of ongoing action in terms of what will happen next. We now put the net under you. Also, they were using jokes like only flying is better, and explanations of what's going to happen next. So, Mrs. X, now it goes up. I turn you to your wheelchair. So there were really step-by-step announcements that were useful to calm residents, to prepare them, give them a feeling of being safe and cared for, including little touches, because as we realized, even just that the person that's being handled there stays calm actually makes the carer's work much easier. If the person would be afraid and would just be shock star, then that would make the handling much more difficult. Maybe you can imagine if you have a child and the child doesn't want to go up from the ground, it's suddenly really heavy to lift up. But if a child wants to be lifted up, then it doesn't weigh much more anymore. So you need the other person to collaborate in a way, even if it's simply being loose and allowing this to happen to you. There were also little manual adjustments where the shortcomings of the machines were fluidly compensated. For instance, here you see the carers are making sure the feet and the legs are not propped against the end of the bed at the end, so the leg is lying loose and flexible. This wasn't verbally announced, but it's important for the comfortable positioning of the resident, and thus also for the successful functionality of the device. So the successful functionality of the device is actually constructed and enabled by the carers detailed action. It's not the device, the machine alone. These small details. And also they're continuously enlisting the residents' collaboration for the process, which could be very slight movements to go into the net, shift of weight, which also has another level where they were explaining to us, it's also important to keep the residents active and give them agency, which in the end has an ethical dimension, that they're exactly not feeling I'm just a package, but I'm actually contributing to this by how I'm shifting my weight as much as I can do. So care is a collaborative task. We learned that robots can't stand on its own, but it needs to be embedded in human interaction, to be introduced, staged, choreographed, embedded in conversation, and adjusted to the circumstances and the body. There was work around the machine from both sides to make the procedure work, to have the machine work, the resident comfortable, and in effect, the carer having less stress. Discussing this for us resulted in a more abstract discussion that it's important, that it's necessary to rethink human-robot interaction beyond the dyadic interaction model, to be at least triadic, to take account of this complex social nature of interactions where there's more than one person involved. So this diagram is trying to envision, to depict the user, the resident, the user staff, and the robot, and all the direct and indirect interactions with each other and with the robot. So also an actual care robot in a similar way would need to be embedded in the interaction, where the robot's agency is actually situated mutual construction, and you can look into the sociology literature about how people deal with robots that finds even more examples of that. So that was really on the abstract side, one of the most important insights actually quite early in the project. But also from the analysis of our ethnography, of our being in the field, we focused on like what topics do we see and what are overlooked topics in care that are not covered well in the work done so far in research, and that sometimes also don't appear so much in these kind of care action catalogs in terms of what nurses do. Things like the importance of intonation, tone of voice, but also the need for intimacy, which can also be sexual, but doesn't need to be. It's simply having people. Contact between residents, that was something we found desperately lacking, with little social life and people really appearing very isolated. But there's also not much happening that actually brings the place to life and gives people something to talk about. And then suddenly a carer brought along his little dog, and suddenly there was this different vibe to the whole place. So the potential of niche areas in this care network of institutionalized care. So then we did brainstorming, idea development, and took this really creative approach combined with the deep analysis of field notes, where we were picking up partially on these overlooked topics as areas of innovation, because it doesn't make sense to build robots and devices that have been done hundreds of times. We also did a little bit of speculative design and developed a multitude of ideas, then converged on a subset based on criteria like what can we actually build ourselves, what would be innovative, what has utility for enhancing care and quality of life, but also what's interesting for ourselves to build and to study then later on. In parallel with some of the idea refinement, we also on the side started with the tech development because time was simply running. And some of the basic underlying technology and those concepts where we had really early positive feedback, said, okay, yeah, that's definitely one of them. So we started working with that. And here you see just some of the stuff. Then we went from the concept to the prototype with feedback from the field. So we had focus group sessions online with 40+ participants who all work in the care sector, a handful of people also who are really in this elderly, not yet in a care home, but were like 70, 80+. And they were discussing 8 concepts as video prototypes, and I'll show two of these. But the first, it's got a voiceover, but that's in German. So people with dementia often forget to drink, and often they just stare into space. So they need some sort of external trigger that reminds them, oh, and just shows them the cup. That's something that we observed. Somebody that's coming and just moving the cup in front of them, and then they suddenly nod and see the cup and drink. But that would require the carer to always be there and see that. So the idea is to have an augmented cup that was getting filled and activated, and if the person isn't drinking, after a while, then it grabs the attention by lighting up and moving. So a dancing cup. And it does that repeatedly unless so it also notices when it's being picked up. And when it's empty, it takes a different color, so the care person can see that. And then in the video, we also thought, well, we don't want the focus groups to just tell us, oh yeah, everything's fine, you had a lot of ideas. So we included these negative scenarios to invite critique, to make it really clear. So this is somebody who's afraid of the cup and doesn't like it. And then, yeah, throws it. And the next scenario is, well, it's a care home, so people aren't sitting alone. There will be other people around, and maybe one person is perfectly fine with the cup, but what's with the person that's next to them? So that's basically it. And the other one, those are also the projects I tell a little bit more about. Sanne is a playful cleaning robot in cat form that's running around looking for places to clean, but it looks like a toy cat. And the kind of movements communicate which direction it's going to move. So this video also shows a little bit of what could happen. It's getting stuck somewhere. But there could also be a problem that somebody overlooks Sanne and falls over it. So we discussed these in focus groups with people who have experience in the sector and got their feedback, and could also put some of that then into the further development of the concepts and prototypes. And then one after one, the prototypes were ready to evaluate with some long delays due to the pandemic, actually. So we had one fully working system and two remote controlled prototypes overall built and tested in care homes, all of these cases in Denmark. So what's different in Denmark compared to Germany is that there a high percentage of residents is living at advanced stages of dementia because they have this focus on supporting aging at home in the municipalities. So it's very late until people go into care homes. So almost all of the residents in a care home have this advanced to severe level of dementia. They're the kinds of residents that are the most easily startled and scared. They have memory issues and cannot easily familiarize themselves with new things anymore. So they're probably the most difficult user group to deal with. But also that meant for us, it's actually the ideal test case. So we're basically going into the worst case scenario and not with people who are still fit. And here you actually see pictures from the first, some of the user tests and the methods of how we have been allowed to document that. So video stills are then drawn over as sketches so you don't recognize the people. And the spectrum of things that we developed in the project goes from the playful speculative to very pragmatic function. So on the left, you see a playful cleaning robot where a pragmatic base functionality of floor cleaning is coupled with a social role and playfulness. And they really loved that one in the care home. So they even put these pictures on their website as advertisement. And on the pragmatic functional side, you have this cup that you already saw in the video as a sketch, with this really pragmatic goal to encourage drinking to prevent dehydration. As I told you, people with dementia simply do not drink enough, and care staff have to repeatedly go around and nudge them. They kind of stare into space, and the core idea is it's the cup itself that draws attention to trigger this drinking schema of seeing, there's a cup, oh, so I should be drinking. And if people don't drink for 5 minutes, then it takes itself to attention again. So that's quite similar to how the care staff would bring the cup back into attention. So this is multimodal because it's light and moving slightly. There's also a little vibration sound, but it needs a very careful design. It shouldn't startle residents, be adjustable, and it's some of these things also already came in the focus group where we, whoop, somebody's micro is on.
Yep,
Somebody has people in the room. Okay. So we could take the feedback from the focus group and we knew what we had to look out for. And this has undergone complete product design, so it could be washable, rechargeable, etc., including hardware electronics data development. So we had the focus group session where we showed them these video prototypes seen earlier in 5 different focus groups with 12 participants that saw this, with a very simple analysis as we are only interested in the comments and suggestions. There were lots of positive comments on the need for something like that and the use of light. Also, the experts that we talked with from gerontology also said that it's really interesting. But they also said this needs to be tried out. People might be afraid, but we just can't tell. And they definitely said it needs to be adjustable to the person. It could be distracting, especially if there are several cups in one room. And it should be subtle enough to not disturb other people, including the care staff. There were concerns it might only work for a subset of patients. And they really stressed that you need to configure the amount of movement and light, and thought that maybe a little vibration may be enough. There were lots of comments on the design. It needs a handle. It needs to be non-breakable, hygienic, the weight. And they all said, this really needs to be trialed. We can't predict if it's going to work. So here you just see some of the technical development. Kevin Lefevre, who did all of that, really went to the whole end to this. So the caregiver can adjust the settings in the back, as you here see, activating it through pressing buttons and putting it on the table. On the bottom, you can do the individual configuration, then you fill in water. The weight of the water activates the mechanism. And there's also an inductive charger because that makes it easy for care staff to use. And only the top thing, the transparent thing, needs to go into the dishwasher. And all the electronics need to be hidden inside. So this is a scenario of use that's staged with people sitting together and not doing much. In the video, I have to tell you, this is actually the hardest movement setting, and it can be much smoother where they then stay on the same spot and only slightly vibrate. So now it's showing that the battery is sufficiently charged. Can you hear the audio of the video? At the moment, it's...
No, we can't hear the audio.
Should have heard the water. Once it's filled, the flashing stops. And then if nothing happens for a while, well, this is sort of Here we put the time frame much shorter than it would normally be. Because it wouldn't make sense to do a video with 5 minutes of waiting. So then at some point, so here it's supposed to be 7 minutes. And that's the hardest setting actually. It quite a bit of experimenting to make sure it stays in roughly the same spot and doesn't fall off the table then. So yeah. And then depending on the resident's preferences, it could just flash up and not move. So that can be changed. And here in more detail, activating. Setting it up where you can choose the color, the light intensity, and the movement strength, because that might really depend on the setting and on the resident. And it's quite interesting, even if it's just moving slightly, but then the movement of the water with the LED color inside, that's actually visually quite interesting then. So here there's so different colors, red, blue, and different degrees of movement, where some of them don't actually move much. So we did a comparative testing in an actual residency home where we had the same residents sitting with a normal cup versus sitting with our cup. So this is an example of a very concrete and isolated problem with a fairly concrete solution. There are actually some cups claiming to do something similar on the market, but they're usually aimed at the mentally fit adults living at home, whereas we had to really think about the interaction with the care staff. And all of the things that are on the market haven't actually been evaluated. So there were 12 residents that they picked for us that are living with dementia at severe stages, stage 5, observed while sitting in a common room situation at multiple occasions, first with a normal cup. So all of these were at least 2 different occasions to get a sort of average with the baseline condition in the first week. And then in the second week, we had to do the same with BIBO. In a normal setting. So each person had 2 up to 4 sessions with BIBO, with our cup, stretched over 3 weeks. Because we are also thinking that there might be some sort of novelty effect, getting to see how they're getting used to the cup, and if there's any alleviation of novelty effects where maybe first they're more afraid or maybe they're more interested. They were all still able to drink themselves, and they were completely free to drink or to reject the cup and then to return to a private room. So here you see it moving. So it's not just the light color, but the movement of water. We had overall 43 sessions with overall 61 hours, an average 1.5 hours of observation per person. Also looking a little bit on the daily condition. So we've measured the fluid intake and did a video analysis to determine the number of sips that we then had to normalize according to time. We actually had to exclude one participant as that person was already drinking too much when they had a normal cup. So staff were saying this person is going to pee too much, so we actually have to restrict him. And they actually removed the cup from him. And there was one other person that deteriorated in the time period. So there's all these issues making research with this kind of user group really difficult, because they might be in a completely different stage in the next week, and they might suddenly be deteriorating so much that they can't actually take part anymore. So this was a lot of effort. So on the left, we see that they drank more with Bibo and took more sips with Bibo as well. So the second one is the average number of sips. When we look closer at the data, we saw there was lots of variation in the first session, that people had Bibo in front of them. So sometimes they were just staring at the cup when it was moving. But we could then see, if we only looked at the second and the third session, that people were getting used to it. So there's a pattern of people drinking more in the subsequent sessions. So on the third one, we actually excluded the first session with Bibo from the data, and we see that the majority drank more, 8 out of 10 people, and overall 33% increase with Bibo and more sips. There was overall more fluid intake as well as visual attention on the cup. There were no signs of fear or other problems, interestingly. Some inspected the cup actually a lot. So we realized we have to make this flap on the bottom much harder to detect. So they were playing with that. And another interesting thing was that they didn't drink immediately. So it would move, and then they would continue to look at it. And like half a minute later, they would pick it up. And then we thought about, what does that mean? But from an ethical standpoint, that's actually a good indication, because that means it's not just a trigger response thing, but the cup came into attention. Yeah, okay, there's a cup. And it was still their decision whether they then took a cup or not, a drink or not. They still decided themselves. They wouldn't immediately react. Yeah. Then I'll tell you about the second robot where we did an extended study. That's the zoomorphic floor washing robot. Really a contrast, a robot concept on the very playful side, exploring the boundary, or rather how to combine a functional and a social playful robotics. And yeah, this was shown on the website of the care home. So the idea emerged out of working with a Danish care home, where on the one side, we observed that floor cleaning, in terms of the time taken, it's physically demanding, time consuming, but still needs to be done daily because hygienics. They told us that they tried out a Roomba and people were scared to shit of it. Because for them, it's a moving black hole. It's moving erratically. It's just this black little thing on the ground. And then we thought, well, any robot that enters such spaces, it automatically has a social presence and is interpreted as a social actor if it's not a black hole. So why don't we explicitly design this social role to also enhance the quality of life? So it's not just a floor cleaning robot. So we combine the floor cleaning function with this playfulness. And we got a lot of inspiration from dementia toys. And in the Danish care home, they had a clinical clown coming in once a week to work with the residents. So it should be amusing and have this pet helper metaphor, a pet that helps out. The first idea was actually a turtle in terms of slow movement. But then we were told, well, a turtle is not a pet people are familiar with. Take something that people are more familiar with. And the cat-like appearance actually reminds of a domestic pet. It's known as friendly, but also a cat sometimes wants to be left alone. The design has big eyes and a cheerful static face. This is all inspired by the dementia toys that are in use. Also the use of color, red and orange are stimulating and easily perceived. But then we were also told, and we learned that from the clown, that it's important how you move. Even as a person, you have to move slow and predictable so as not to scare these people. So Sanne slows down when approaching residents, then it sits on the spot and it's wiggling sideways to draw attention. And only if the residents react positively will it come closer. It intentionally has this comic style shape, so it's zoomorph, but toy-like, to not mislead residents about its robotic nature. We did an in situ observation of this robot in care homes in Odense. It was visitor was controlled, and we did video observation analysis. And overall, 30 residents at late stage dementia and other comparable cognitive impairments encountered the robot. So here's like a little segment where it's approaching and then not getting too close. And now this person and moving sideways. And this person is actually trying to lure the robot on with their feet. Key findings were that residents were not scared at all. And the majority, I think, apart from one person, were positively interested or at least actively ignored the robot. So it wasn't a disturbance. And they had this really positive response to the wiggling pattern, moving pattern used when approaching the residents. Then when it got closer, they wanted to pet Susanne, as you see in the little comic strip thing, and to interact with it. They were talking to the robot and luring it to them. Interesting was also that looking at how the staff introduced the robot, they reacted differently. So when the staff said, this is a cat, the resident said, no, this is not a cat. But when they introduced it, this is Sanne, she helps us cleaning the floors, they were really positively, sometimes investigated it, but then you got this as if playful interaction where they were luring and petting it and talking with it. There were many instances that reveal that it's actually, they were aware it's a technical object, like they would knock on its head and then say, poor thing, you cannot feel this, but then talking to it as if it was a cat. So there was this going back and forth between as if and looking at, oh, where are the wheels? So this really lightened up the mood, created instances of interaction also with other residents, and shows that such a concept can succeed and have a positive contribution. But also that, I mean, one of the main things in care is that the ethics and care specialists are afraid that having a robot that people would think would be misled to believe it's actually a thinking and feeling being. And here, this definitely was not the case. The third one that we evaluated is a plant watering robot, where we kind of did the reverse thing. With Sanne, we reversed secondary and primary function of the robot. On a surface level, it's going around and watering the plants, but the actual intention is to provide entertainment. And we had this underlying, more general questions. How do people react to a robot that's not one entity, but constitutes an ensemble? So there's a ship, but there's also this little captain on top. And we tested this in a public setting in a care home. This worked okay, but not as well as Sanne. As a concept, it would actually need much more work, especially on this narrative aspect. But nevertheless, the interesting observation was that in this case, it was mostly the man that engaged with the robot in the care home, maybe because of the boat form, while Sanne appeared to be more universally appealing and engaging. So this was really just a design exercise to flesh out a well-conceptual idea of making visible a robot is not a unitary entity. There were also a number of other ideas that remained only at concept level that I don't have time to talk about. So here's just a short overview of the diversity idea, but it was too small a project to realize more than 3 of these. And 2 of these, the CAP and Sanne, have been studied in more depth. So these were, 2 of our outcomes evaluated positively, standing in for this large design space of alternative care robots that do not substitute interaction, but facilitate and enrich it. And also that try to bring something lively and fun into this care home situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva, for an absolutely fascinating talk. I mean, I thought it was theoretically very important, this idea of going back to first principles and thinking a robot doesn't have to be a science fiction humanoid. But the case studies were really, really interesting as well. So I've invited people to ask questions. You can either raise your hand. Hang on, where am I going to see the hand raises? Or put a message in the chat, or in fact, just speak up. So do we have some questions?
I stopped the screen sharing because then I can see more of you.
Yes, that's fine. That's fine. While people are getting going, I have a very small question. With Bibo, the dancing cup, there was one person who drank a lot less with Bibo than without. And did you explore why that was?
I think we couldn't figure that out. So in the end, our answer is that it's not a solution for every resident, for every patient, but for some people, for the majority, 8 out of 10, it really had a difference.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but that was kind of that we always said, well, some people might not like it. Some people might remain skeptical, so maybe it's not something for everyone. But if it works even for half the residents, it would probably be something that's useful.
Yes, oh, absolutely. I just wondered whether you could learn something from why that person in particular.
It could even be that in that second week, that person was in a different physical condition or mental condition, and just didn't react as much. So that's something that we don't quite know. We only basically were able to exclude the person who in the second time, only did one session and then fell sick, or the person that drank too much.
Right, thank you. Okay, we've got Effie, Alistair, and then Victor. So Effie, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Great. And Eva, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. So I could not hear the sound of the cup. So I would like to ask what kind of sound emitted from the cup? Is it kind of just catch attention, or even some voice that the user like to hear, remind them to drink? So what kind of voice?
No voice.
No voice. Okay, just some sound.
And that's so some of the cups that have been developed for use at home, they have like the children's voice with an actual recording. And that was something that people said, this is for the care home situation. You have a resident room with like 15 people sitting distributed. You don't want all these voices.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, makes sense.
And it's more like this, something a little, just trying, Zoom isn't good in picking up these kinds of sounds. So it's depending on how much it's moving. When it's moving more, there's more sound. Partially it's the motor that you hear that's doing the turning. But it's not that noisy.
Okay. How about the cat? Is the cat also emit some sound to attract attention, or meow when people talk to it?
The version that we tested there doesn't have sound apart from the movements, but we then I'd have to ask. They wanted to evaluate that. We developed a version with sounds that were actually created by this clown, where it's sort of or if it wants to move on, or it's entering a room, it makes a different sound. So we designed a couple of different sounds for just announcing that it's there, or announcing it wants to go into a room, or it can also have a sound that it does when, for instance, the battery dies and it wants to alert a caregiver. Then it sounds slightly different, and the caregiver would know that it needs help.
Okay, fantastic job. So I give it to Alistair. So
yes,
thank you.
Okay, thanks. Interesting work, Eva. I was interested in the individual difference in the cup example. It's really a follow-on from what Helen was pushing at, I think. I would predict you probably had differences there according to the dementia profile of your participants. Frederick in particular was an outlier. No, we know from
I see.
dementia that anything that's unfamiliar is bad news. You have to keep things that are really familiar. So I would look at the individual profiles of the advancement of the dementia for those 3 Ps. There was sort of Elred, Berta, and Frederick.
Frederick is the one that didn't drink. Mm.
Yeah, but you got 2 there where it's non-significant. There was hardly any difference. The other thing is that you got quite a difference in reaction between your cat and the cup. Now, you actually mentioned that most people were fairly curious about the cat. Again, with dementia, there's a very different agency with a cup because you're plonking something in front of someone and you're forcing the interaction. The cup does that by initiative. Very different from something that's more remote and more social, like the cat. So it'd be interesting to follow up and actually probe some of the reasons why your participants at the individual level, according to the dementia profile, liked a particular robot intervention or didn't. I would think you'd find quite large differences according to the dementia profile.
Okay, to answer that in detail, I would need to know more about that because also for data privacy reasons, they don't give us access to the exact profile of the people. So for the CAP study, we know they were on stage 5 and more on the global deterioration scale of dementia. And I mean, I have to take their word, that's already quite an advanced level.
Yeah, okay. But if you get more follow-up studies, you could obviously probe it with the individuals, your subjects, about the fear reaction, anxiety.
There was no fear reaction, actually.
No, that's interesting.
Mm.
Because generally you predict if it was a familiar cup, in other words, one that looked like something they were used to, that'd be fine. If it was something clearly new, you get an anxiety reaction there.
So we had no anxiety reaction. For that, to make sure, we also had a pilot with an earlier version where there was really the care person sitting right next to it. And if the test, I think like 3 people with dementia, if they would have reacted in any negative way, they would have interfered. In our study, there was also always a care person in the room, but actually nobody was scared.
Right.
And as I mentioned, we realized that when they had the moving cup the first time, the first session, a lot of them drank only the same or actually less than with a normal cup. But if we then looked at the second and the third time, they suddenly drank more. So there was some sort of getting familiar with it, even though they had this really advanced levels of dementia, where actually we would almost have expected them to not recognize the thing anymore.
Okay.
So some sort of
Well, there's someone
familiarity
else.
was going on.
Yeah, I think you will get a familiarity effect, but that will differ between individuals. Anyway, I better let other people get on with questions.
Thank you, Alistair. Victor, over to you.
Thank you, Eva. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Helen. So, first of all, thank you very much for your talk. Very, very inspiring. So I want to ask you about the robots, especially. So I understand that in both experiments, with both the cat robot and the plant watering one, they were teleoperated, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder if the fact of teleoperating the robot makes some sort of effect on the way they react, because I guess these motions, they might not be very fluid and natural because there's someone deciding how the robot move. So yeah, that's basically my question. If you could identify or kind of you can generate some hypotheses about the impact of this, of fact of teleoperating the robot, or maybe allowing them to be autonomous.
So the wiggling movement that was pre-programmed and was something where you could just activate that. There were clear ethical reasons why it was teleoperated, because having that as an actual, at this stage where we are still testing the idea, we would either have to put in so much effort into having this thing moving really safely, detecting when it's too close, immediately moving back if the person is afraid or something. So we had to teleoperate. There was no way around that. But the person doing that was at the back, so the residents wouldn't see it. So we don't think it had much of an effect. Clearly, there might be slight differences in how an actual self-agentic robot might be moving. But that's something we can't yet do that much about.
Okay. Is it something you would look into in the future?
It's quite common to do robot studies with remote controlled robots when the idea is about figuring out how do people actually react and what does this tell us about how we need to design, like trying out movement patterns, trying out form factors.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions? People are thanking you in the chat because some people are having to leave. But just the last question from me then, what are your plans for the future? Because this was obviously a really interesting project to get going. Have you plans for more research?
So yeah, that's a difficult question because this sort of open-ended research, you don't have many options for. So at the moment, we're there a little bit stuck. If there are project partners in order, but then we would probably have to go for EU funding. So that's not as easy, but in the German system, you have, for something like that, you'd have to work with a concrete company and work towards a product, where I think that's a little bit at odds with our approach of really going in open-ended. There's a project in Austria that basically picked up on our ideas. They're between Vienna and Salzburg, I think. And they're kind of picking up on what we've done, doing it larger scale, because I got with the Austrian funding scheme more funding to do that. So there's interesting work coming out of there.
And it's obviously very hard to do it at a larger scale because it's so complicated and intensive working with people in care homes.
That's doing these kind of studies, even finding the participants, figuring out when they're okay to do it. You might have somebody in mind, but then on the day you're there, they're in a bad mood. All these little things. And care homes don't have much time to contribute to research unless they're being paid.
Yeah.
So they would either need to be partners. And one of the reasons we collaborated in the end more with the Danish care homes was that their situation is a bit more relaxed, and they were actually extremely interested in trying out novel technologies. They appear to be doing that a little bit more than German care homes, where the economic situation is differently. But yeah, at the moment, no robot work, sadly, although I'd love to do more on that.
Right.
Learned a lot.
We wish you luck then in finding more funding from somewhere or another. So any other questions? No, I don't think so. So thank you Eva very much for a really fascinating and interesting talk. This talk the recording will be up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. I'll put a link on the Interacting with Computers website. If you go to the bottom of the homepage of the Interacting with Computers, there's a box that says online seminars. Go from there. And there'll be another talk in about 8 weeks' time in March. I'm still negotiating with who that will be and exactly what day, but it'll be on the website and I'll advertise it widely. So please join us again. So the only thing I don't like about Zoom talks is we can't clap you properly. So thank you very much. We've got people clapping and thanking you in the chat. So thank you very much.
Also really interesting to see where people are from in the chat.
Yes, yeah, we have people from all over the place, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, good.
quite cool.
Okay, bye now, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Yeah, yes.